Hello and welcome back to the Weighted Native Chronicles. Right now in Alberta, citizens are gathering signatures to push for a referendum on whether the province should separate from Canada. In response, many First Nations leaders have joined together to voice strong opposition, arguing that Alberta cannot separate because the treaties do not permit it. In this video, I'm also going to explain something crucial: how having a referendum is not an act of separation itself. A referendum is simply a way for Albertans to express what they think and measure public sentiment, nothing more. Which raises a troubling question. If a referendum doesn't change borders, laws, or treaties, why are some leaders trying to block even that step? Are they really saying Albertans have no right to express their opinions? But to begin with, I would like to critically examine the claim that the current configuration of Canada may not be changed due to treaties that were signed, because when you slow down and examine it carefully, a serious inconsistency appears. Today, I want to respectfully challenge that specific argument, not challenging Indigenous rights, not treaty legitimacy, and not Indigenous self determination, just the logic being used. First of all, the claim being made. The argument from First Nations chiefs goes like this: the number of treaties were signed between Indigenous nations and the Crown. Therefore, Alberta cannot legally separate from Canada because the treaties were made with Canada, not Alberta, so hence they do not allow it. On the surface, that sounds straightforward, but there's the question that rarely gets asked: who were the treaties actually originally signed with? Canada or Great Britain? The treaties were not signed with Canada as we know it today. They were signed with the British Crown. The Queen, being Victoria at the time, is referred to throughout their texts. At the time most treaties were signed, Canada was not fully sovereign. Foreign policy, constitutional authority, and ultimate sovereignty still rested in Britain. So these treaties were agreements between Indigenous nations and the British Crown, not an independent Canadian state. Yet today, those same treaties are enforced by Canada, which raises an unavoidable question: how can that be? If treaties cannot survive a change in sovereignty, how did they survive the transfer from Britain to Canada? Canada became fully independent over time, authority shifted, the governing state changed, and yet the treaties remained valid. No new consent process took place, no re-signing of treaties occurred. The obligations simply carried forward to a new sovereign state. So here's the inconsistency. If it was acceptable for treaty obligations to transfer from the British Crown to a newly independent Canada, why would it suddenly be impossible for those same obligations to carry forward again if Alberta became independent? If sovereignty can change once without destroying treaties, then, of course, sovereignty changing again does not automatically lead to their invalidation. You can't argue both positions at the same time. Either the treaties survive political change or they don't. Let me be very clear about what this argument does not mean in the context of a newly formed state of Alberta. It does not mean treaties disappear. It does not mean Indigenous rights vanish. It does not mean Alberta gains authority over First Nations. And it does not mean Indigenous consent suddenly stops mattering. In fact, international law generally treats treaties as obligations that bind successor states, which means an independent Alberta would still be bound by treaty responsibilities just as Canada is today. Before going further, it's important to ease a very real concern. A referendum, even one that passes, is not separation. It's simply a way of measuring public sentiment. Nothing changes overnight. No borders shift, no laws vanish, and no rights disappear. A referendum result is only a signal, a call to begin discussions, not a declaration of independence, as many seem to depict it as. If a majority of Albertans ever voted in favor of separation, the next step would not be independence. The next step would be negotiations. As the Supreme Court of Canada has already made clear when the matter of Quebec separation was put before it, the federal government would then be required to sit down with representatives of Alberta to hammer out, in good faith, the terms of any possible separation. That process could take years. It probably would take years. And it would be impossible to do without Indigenous nations being central participants in those discussions, as our Constitution requires in Section 35. From the federal government's perspective, there would almost certainly be a non-negotiable condition to these discussions. Any new state of Alberta would be required to assume all existing treaty rights and obligations within its territory, exactly as Canada itself did when authority shifted from Britain to an independent Canadian state. That continuity isn't theoretical, it's historical precedent. So in real day-to-day terms, very little would actually change. Treaty hunting rights would remain. Fishing rights would remain. Trapping rights would remain. Land use protections would remain. Duty to consult obligations would remain. The flag on the building might change. The legal responsibilities would not. Just as they didn't change when Britain stepped back and Canada stepped forward. So separation, if it were ever to occur, which is not a sure thing by any means, would not erase Indigenous rights anyways. It would not reset history, and it would not wipe the slate clean. It would require the new state of Alberta to carry forward the same responsibilities that already exist today, which means most Indigenous people would likely see far less change than they are often led to fear. This doesn't mean that separation is good. It doesn't mean separation is inevitable. But it does mean this issue deserves calm, rational discussion rather than fear, hyperbole, exaggeration, and radicalization from any side. Treaties are not disposable. They survived one transfer of sovereignty. History shows they would survive another. Strong disagreements can exist without abandoning consistency, reason, or mutual respect. Whatever one's position on Alberta's future, this conversation should be guided by historical fact, legal reality, and a shared commitment to keeping the temperature low and the dialogue constructive. That's how serious issues deserve to be discussed. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to watch. I wish you, your family, and all Albertans God's blessing and wisdom during these potentially turbulent times. So from the Weighty Native Chronicles, catch you next time. Did you like this video? If you did, I think you're going to like this one right over here. So check it out. And I appreciate your subscribing if you haven't done so already. Remember to do that while you're watching this next video. Click like, it all helps us out for this channel. Catch you next time.